Welcome to Thinking Out Loud, the podcast that puts you inside conversations with the most deeply passionate, intensely dedicated, and yes, the most thoughtful people in our industry. So, sit back and stay tuned. They may just change the way you think.
Welcome to a special edition of Thinking Out Loud. In this two-part episode, Mathew Ball, analyst, venture capitalist, and CEO of Epyllion Industries, and host Vicky Lenz explore the waves of competition in media, the stimuli that have changed the industry landscape over time, and the strategies that have won the loyalty of consumers.
Hello, I'm Vicky Lenz, President and CEO of CTAM, a marketing organization focused on the media, entertainment, and technology industry. Today I'm speaking with Mathew Ball, CEO of Epyllion Industries, which is a venture and corporate advisory firm. Matt's also a venture partner at Makers Fund and an advisor to Telefilm Canada. And from 2016 to 2018, he served as the global head of strategy for Amazon Studios. And prior to that was a director at the Chernin Group's Otter Media. Matt also hosts bylines at the New York Times, The Economist, and more. So you have likely heard from him in some way, shape, or form recently. Matt, welcome, and thanks so much for sitting down with us today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So there's a saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But in our industry today, it certainly feels like the more things change, the more they're changing. Why don't you give us a landscape view of what the heck is really going on?
That's a great question. And to answer a question as to whether or not the history is going to change, it helps to actually go back even farther, well beyond digital disruption, even the rise of the cable bundle, and to understand at a basic frame of reference that the media industry itself has been in a multi-decade process of conglomerization, of expansion, of proliferation into new media categories. We can think of that in the sense that CBS was a radio station, ended up buying Simon & Schuster, ended up moving into television. That television was based in broadcast. That broadcast moved to cable. And then, of course, Viacom CBS ended up owning a film studio at one point, theaters, and is now going digital. The best way to understand what's happening in this landscape today is to understand how we've seen this path before. To give a great example, Hello, Dolly comes out in 1967. It is the Academy Award winner for Best Actress, Barbra Streisand, then one of the biggest stars in the world, Best Song, as well as Best Picture. And the economics of that title, however creatively successful and critically successful, led to what's today a $70 million loss in 2019 terms. That led the producing studio Fox to go into insolvency. That led Fox to be recapitalized. It ended up buying ski resorts and a bottling company. And then a few years later, we saw Columbia go through its own financial turmoil that led it to being sold to Coca-Cola, a soft drink manufacturer. Then it ended up being sold from Coca-Cola to Sony. And of course, Sony at the time was predominantly in the Walkman and television business. This is a long-winded way of saying when we take a look at the video industry today, we see these companies, Amazon, Apple, AT&T, Comcast, building out these expansive flywheels and platforms, these services-based businesses where video isn't the thing, it's part of the thing. I like to joke that the streaming wars aren't a war, they're just a battle in the ecosystem wars. And the truth of the matter is we're seeing this faster than ever before because of digital disruption. We're seeing this faster than ever before because of distribution costs over the internet being close to zero. It's not like standing up a new movie theater, marketing a film. But this process of expansion from Disney making a movie to a theme park to products to television, or of bringing all these assets together and seeing how you can diversify across them, we've been seeing that since the 60s. And if you wanted to, you could go back to the teens.
So let's dive into a few pieces of that. Let's go back to the pay TV traditional business for a moment.
Right.
You have written about how what we're seeing is really a systemic undermining of a business that has years of life left. And I also see that very clearly from the central role that I play at CTAM. And there are days where I want to sort of say, hey, stop, wait, everybody, take a breath. But we seem to be plowing forward in this eagerness to get to what's next. So talk to us a little bit about where you see the traditional business and where are we missing some opportunities perhaps to slow down and protect the equity that we worked so hard to build?
Yeah, I basically take a look at what's happened over the past 15 years to pay TV, and I think of it in three waves. And I think it's really important to understand those waves as different, and they don't relate to really when Netflix or Hulu launched per se, or when the so-called streaming wars kicked off. That is to say that when we take a look at the 2000s was the period in which we saw rapid increases in pricing in television. We saw rapid expansions in the number of cable channels. We saw the early starts of the peak TV era. It is clear to any economist and even to many consumers who actually take a look at the a la carte prices for their television that the bundle produces value. The aggregation of content into a single price that's all you can eat was good for the entire ecosystem. I'll give you an example. In 1961, pay television fully penetrated. 9 in 10 homes had broadcast television. In 2010, it was still at 90%, but we went from 90% paying zero to 90% paying $70 per month. That sounds bad. The forced cable bundle sounds bad, but the average household went from 5 to 8.5 hours per day of video. That's a 75% increase. Many consumers would say, I only want 5 channels, I only want 7 channels. But the fact that discovery was so frictionless, you could channel change, channel surf, get bored, move, discover content from a network you might not watch all the time, but you at least watch a half hour or an hour or a show. That diversity of access, the diversity of content, the shared success in the cable bundle was healthy in the extent to which it built overall consumption in this medium well beyond what you would get in just free, well beyond what you would get with 4 networks. CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox themselves would not have been able to reach 8.5 hours. But in the 2000s, we ended up hitting this period where the bundle started to pervert. The incentives were a little bit too extended. It is clear that we saw so many channels, so much content, such price increases that it was starting to outstrip what many people needed. That's where we talk about classic disruption theory, and too many people were being overserved. However, it's important to understand that pay TV was still growing in consumption. Pay TV was still growing in the volume of content it was offering. And very few people would say that pay TV in 2010 was not better than in 2000. It might have been more expensive, but it was probably better. We had more RSNs, we had more sports rights, we had Mad Men and Breaking Bad, shows that were inconceivable a decade earlier. But that's where we started to see the separation of sufficient value from acceptable price for consumers. The second phase starts really in 2007, but we see it through the 2010s, and that is to say, new video substitutes emerge that don't erode the direct value of the pay TV bundle. Comcast or Charter were still good value. Again, $70 for 450 hours watched for the average household is enormously efficient. But we have Netflix and Hulu and then Amazon who emerge, and they're offering substantially better value in terms of how much you watch, what that experience is, and the price that you pay for it. But during the second phase, something distinct is still happening. Television is still getting better. We have improvements in the UI and X. We actually have some price improvements as virtual MVPDs come out, like DirecTV Now at much lower prices. And we still see more content coming out. Peak TV goes from about 250 series in 2011 to 400 by 2016, almost all of which are in the pay TV bundle. And so it's doubtlessly true that pay TV is still getting better. So phase 1, pay TV is probably getting too costly, and even though the value is high, the minimum threshold is too high too. The 2010s up until about 2019, you have the emergence of increasingly popular substitutes that are much better value. They might still have major inadequacies, live sports, live news, first window content, but obviously Netflix was very high value at the time, $9 of ARPU for 60 hours per month, but pay TV was still getting better. What we have in 2019, and this is answering your systemic erosion point, is the third phase state, which is we are now at an unprecedented time in which pay TV as a bundle, irrespective of Netflix and others, is actually getting worse. The price is still going up, but if we take a look at what key market participants are doing, they are harvesting the ecosystem. Warner Media continues to move many of its signature series from TBS and TNT out of cable and into HBO Max, either as day of shared rights or as exclusives. There are several series that were once intended for NBC and USA, such as Brave New World and the Saved by the Bell reboot, but NBC Universal has decided to make them Peacock exclusives. Disney continues to take many of its series that were available on repeat or intended for distribution on Disney Junior or the Disney Channel, and they're moving them over to Disney Plus. We've seen this further. Viacom CBS has taken very successful shows such as The Good Wife, rebooted them as The Good Fight, and they're only available outside of the pay TV ecosystem. The last and best example is FX. John Landgraf initiated a program a few years ago to roughly double the output of FX. And last year, Disney decided that half of FX's slate is only going to be available on Hulu. You can't even get it in the pay TV bundle. It was going to be in the pay TV bundle. And the remaining half of FX's programming goes to FX the next day with either no or low ads and on demand. And FX Plus, which was an add-on subscription that had a large portion of the FX library, was only available to consumers via pay TV. Now it's going to be Hulu exclusive. So we are seeing this shift that as all of these major media companies are moving towards digital direct-to-consumer relationships, they see some form of race and urgency. They are not just trying to manage the transition, they're now actively harvesting what is in the system. And that means that that system is going to get worse. We are actually going to see a massive drop, COVID aside, in the amount of programming available in that system. That will compound over time. And so as opposed to prior years when we saw escalating value compared to better substitutes, when we saw escalating prices commensurate with value, we are now at the point in which we're seeing TV, the bundle, have less. And what it has left is not the best of programming. I see that as distinctive. And that to me is the biggest challenge to any form of bundle or pay TV service or even managing current cord-cutting declines.
Is that a chicken and the egg scenario where you could say consumers led the industry to make these decisions to shift to what they wanted, or the industry started to make these moves to shift and consumers started to gravitate to what they were being offered?
Right. I mean, I would think about it this way, right? It is not necessarily a chicken and the egg problem per se, though, of course, in a macro sense, we know that direct-to-consumer SVOD is the preferred audience path, and therefore, inevitably, the industry was going to move to digital direct-to-consumer first strategies. But this harvesting thing is partly an industry cohort behavior, which is there is some general belief that perhaps consumers don't have a fixed cap to how many subscriptions they have, 3 versus 4 versus 5 or 6 or 7. Though, of course, John Stanky and others have been clear that they think there is, or they fear that there is, but that there are at least benefits to how early you are in making that transition, which is to say, perhaps the audience doesn't cap at 6, but the earlier you are, the more likely you are to be in that 6, or you believe that maybe number 4 can reach 7 out of 10 households, but number 5 will cap at 5. And so that gives you incentives to be earlier. But so as a result, it's not so much consumer chicken and the egg in this specific sense, but it is prisoner's dilemma. It is scenario planning. Once one person makes a break, once AT&T decides that they are going to start using HBO Max as the exclusive destination for True TV and TBS and TNT, once Disney starts shifting more of their best content elsewhere, you have collective behavior that forces everyone to shift faster. If you are anchored on the old system and your competitors collaborate with you for success and your competitors move on, you have to too, which is to say Warner Media, Viacom, Disney, NBC Universal all collaborated in the cable bundle. But what that means is if three of your collaborators leave, thus harming that bundle, or rather undermine it, and you're left, you actually still get dragged down with some of that erosion, but you're not collecting the proceeds. And on the other hand, you now see dwindling opportunity or a race for the new thing that your competitors are going at faster. Whether or not this is 2019 or 2018 or 2017 or 2022 was really a question of competitive behavior. And of course, we can go back as early as 2013 when Reed Hastings was saying this is how you stop Netflix and expecting most of these companies to do that through Hulu or some other vehicle. In that regard, this may be later than anticipated.
So part of this inevitable transition will likely lead to the demise of traditional cable network brands. The standalone value of a TBS or a TNT is greatly diminished when it becomes a subcategory of what's available on HBO Max. And we've seen a rise in the appeal and equity of program brands, where consumers are seeking out the program they want to watch, and the program stands for something in their minds. But where that program resides is no longer as important destination-wise for the consumer experience. So talk to us a little bit about that path and how you see that playing out.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting parts about that is we are at this weird state in the transition where everyone is coming with slightly different brands, slightly different content, and yet their ambitions are largely the same. And by that, I mean, what is the goal of Hulu? Let's put aside economics, but or monetization. It is go after as many people for as much time as possible, with as much content as possible, with as much diversity as possible. We're going after everyone in the States. We're going to have all genres. We're going to have all styles, and we want them to watch Hulu as much as possible. Netflix doing the same thing. HBO very clearly doing the same thing in the rebrand to Max. That's why they had an ad campaign juxtaposing The Sopranos with Big Bang Theory with a pun on the bar that Tony Soprano used to frequent. And this whole strategy, which again is then going to be augmented by the shift to a lower price AVOD service, is not distinct from what Peacock is doing. Peacock is more clearly anchored in comedy because of NBC's history. But of course, they're coming out with a dark, high-budget Brave New World. Amazon, of course, is going after multiple genres: superhero, dark, gritty, lighthearted female comedy, international content as well. As a result, we're actually seeing a general shift away from specific brand ethos because the argument is we want to go after everyone all the time. And that's possible in digital delivery, right? NBC had to decide what it was at 8 p.m. in a way that Netflix does not or Hulu does not. They can be anything for everyone. Over time, we may see a slight reversion to more specific articulation. So if and as Hulu Max struggles to achieve Netflix-esque scale, we might see perhaps not an abandonment of large aspirations, but more of a focus on a specific brand ethos and curatorial vision. If Peacock starts to plateau and or finds that actually high-budget dramas and sci-fi dystopic pieces aren't really resonating, you might see them lean more into an ad campaign or a brand ethos around just being the best of comedy. But right now we're at a point in which everyone wants to be everything, and that's fine, reasonable, and certainly the biggest pie. But we might see a slight return to more of a brand-centric approach in the years to come, especially if and as Netflix, ends up remaining the most dominant video platform for premium content in the years to come.
So hits are really important because they draw consumers, they draw eyeballs. When Netflix had House of Cards, there was a noticeable spike for them. Hulu with Handmaid's Tale, you can go on. And I guess the other category here that's such a driver is a well-recognized library of value. So how do you see this playing out across the landscape right now. You've got Warner Media, you've got Viacom, you've got NBC Universal, you've got Disney. Everybody's got sort of a hit or two and a library of value, and they're playing these sort of big brand names against each other right now to try to get consumers to want that, to feel like they should subscribe to that. That's almost an unwinnable race, right? You can't continue to just go for that big hit, the big name, or can you?
That's a great question, Vicki. When we take a look at how the industry is working right now, there's been this phenomenal shift towards these big hits because the monetization models in SVOD are different than what they were in the traditional system. I like to talk about the idea that historically in the cable bundle, no one had AMC because of The Walking Dead per se. They might have The Walking Dead in the bundle, or rather AMC in the bundle, because AMC was able to use that title to get distributed in Comcast and get carried at a higher affiliate fee. But ultimately, those deals run for multiple years. The average consumer doesn't actually get to say in 2011, the success of Walking Dead is why I subscribe to that channel. In addition, the revenue from The Walking Dead was largely linearly correlated with the audience, which is to say The Walking Dead at 10 p.m., if it gets 1 million people versus 1.2 million people, that's a roughly 20 or 25% difference in revenue, depending on which your reference frame is. So in the old model, the value of a hit was diffuse because you had multiple year contracts across multiple different MVPDs, all of which valued you for a variety of different things, not just a show. And the revenue model for that show was directly connected to what the audience was. That's not how SVOD works. In SVOD, in a subscription environment, a hit show can be the specific binary difference between having a network and not. Because of Game of Thrones, you have HBO or you don't. That's not a linear difference. That's a difference between Vicky giving HBO $15 and giving $0. In addition, you have enormous ancillary lift. Let's use CBS All Access. Picard comes out earlier this year. Like Game of Thrones, it drives additions. And so that doesn't just drive more revenue to CBS All Access, but perhaps you'd like Twilight Zone from Jordan Peele, but not enough to get CBS All Access. Now, because you've joined CBS All Access for the hit Picard, you then try Twilight Zone, then you like Twilight Zone. There actually isn't direct revenue here because, again, there's not, for most consumers, advertising-based service, and therefore you're not capturing incremental revenue, but there's strategic lift in having you addicted to more of the shows on that network. This is all really complicated, and the dynamics can be hard to pin down, but the implication here is that these hits, or what I would define as behavior-altering titles, they don't need to hit everyone, but they need to convince Vicky to subscribe, are more important than ever. There's no way around that in the subscription era. And again, that doesn't mean it needs to be a tentpole. It can be something small like the Twin Peaks reboot, but it needs to alter user behavior. That won't go away. Whomever survives is going to have to keep playing this game and keep producing. But your question of can it go on forever is also a question of who will. And that is to say, one of the things that we've seen for quite some time is asymmetric abilities to create hits. I'll give you an example. Tiger King came out from Netflix. It popped to global significance. I think we can reasonably assume that while the content of Tiger King is the same irrespective of who releases it, had that come out on CBS All Access or Epix or maybe even Showtime, it wouldn't have popped, right? Netflix has greater reach and more frequency of use and longer session times than anyone else, which is to say more people have Netflix than Showtime, more people use Netflix per week, or the average user uses Netflix per week more frequently than they do Epix. And when they're using it, it's not for half an hour, it's for several hours. That ability to create hits is an enormous moat. Showtime last year came out with a Kevin Bacon series. They also came out with, earlier this year, or I think in the fall, The Loudest Voice with Russell Crowe starring as Roger Ailes. That was Russell Crowe's first show ever, and it usually went by unnoticed. I think we can reasonably assume that those would have been more popular shows had they been released elsewhere. Of course, a few days ago, Schitt's Creek ended up doing a clean sweep at the Emmys with all 7 category nominations, 1 out of 7 possible nominations. And Eugene Levy, when he started his acceptance speech, said he wanted to, quote, thank Netflix who set this whole thing off. And then today it was announced that CBS was licensing several of their early shows to Netflix for 1-year licenses so that they could build audiences. That's actually a reflection of the fact the rest of the ecosystem is saying Netflix can produce hits more easily than anyone else from a distribution standpoint. And so ultimately, the question that you're asking is going to come down to scale in some regard in terms of audience, which isn't different, but the dynamic is new.
You mentioned the Emmys. We're talking about hits and attracting viewers and finding new audiences. You wrote an interesting piece about the Emmys for The Economist. Talk to us a little bit about your take on the awards show and the relevance of it and the importance of it and what it tells us about the direction that TV is taking.
I mean, it really gets back to your earlier point on the more things change, the more they stay the same. When we take a look at the past 5 years or this 5 years preceding this year's award show, HBO and Netflix had roughly 50% of all nominations. And this was the year that the streaming wars were supposed to kick off. November of 2019 saw Apple TV Plus, it saw Disney Plus, it saw in May was the relaunch of HBO Max. In April, we had the early launch of Peacock, Quibi as well. CBS and Viacom continue to unveil new and original programming. And yet this year, Netflix and HBO again had 50% of nominations. Over the past 5 years, HBO has won the best drama in 4 of those 5 years. This year it won again, so that's 5 in 6. We saw some difference. Pop was nominated for its 2nd time ever. Pop won. But again, as I just mentioned, many people, including most viewers and certainly Netflix, would say that Schitt's Creek is effectively a Netflix show. And certainly Netflix, as the long-term SVOD licensor or licensee of Schitt's Creek, will collect most of the benefit from the win, much like Breaking Bad was not a Netflix show, but Netflix elevated it to pop culture success such that it could win the Emmys and then collected much of the benefit from its success and still does to this day with spin-offs like El Camino. And so I think when we take a look at the Emmy, it is very clear that there is some signaling value from success here. HBO also makes the point that you can have super popular shows that are behavior affecting to subscribers and win awards, and they have continued to prove that. But what's astonishing is, again, if you looked at the success this year, if you looked at the nominations this year, and you went back to 2015 and said, hey, the future is going to look like this, but which year do you think this nomination slate comes from? They'd have no idea that it was at a point in time in which the market was more competitive than ever.
In part 1, Matthew and Vicky explained how decades of competition in the media industry has created the current entertainment and media landscape. In part 2, Matthew and Vicky discussed the impact of scale on content performance, distribution, and cost, and how the streaming wars has settled into a convergence of content and tech.
We've been talking about content. Let's talk about scale and this quote-unquote race to scale. And how important is it to be big? And what happens to those who are not?
Some of what we were just discussing on Netflix's asymmetric ability to launch a hit is a good way to think about the returns from scale. I think the other element that we can think of is how being large also de-risks failure, or at least elevates underperformance, which is to say, the cost of content is fixed irrespective of whether or not you are a large or mid or low-sized streaming service. Epix does not pay less than Netflix or HBO does. However, it needs a much larger portion of its audience to watch a show for that show to be economical. Netflix, similarly, because it is much larger and reaches people more easily, more frequently, more times per week and for longer, has not only a lower penetration threshold, but a greater ease of reaching that audience. And so that allows things that might be overlooked, like Tiger King, to pop. It also means that some shows that are a little bit more middle of the road can still hit an economical threshold. And then, of course, there are elements such as pricing and so forth. The more frequently you're used, the more people you have, the more programming you have a greater than average ability to price. There's a reason why over time, and I find this astonishing, since 2010, not a single one of Netflix's competitors has increased their price. Hulu has done 2 price drops during that time. They were once $11.99, then they went to $9.99. Now they're $6.99 or $5.99 rather. And then Showtime has dropped about $2. Starz has dropped about $2. HBO used to retail through various MVPDs as an ultra premium product at $15, $16, or $17, sometimes $18. Now you'll find it's almost always $16 to $15, whether through MVPDs or otherwise. And so we are seeing a number of different proof points of how important scale is here. And I think if we got out of the question of purely quality of content, which we can talk about, and I am indeed a big believer in, and HBO's success is a testament to, but said that if content matters, the network that can more easily launch a hit, can more easily achieve its break even, can more easily afford content, and is through those same dynamics more easily able to increase its prices, that's where you start to see multiple different points of scale-based returns.
We recently saw Disney play around with 2 different release approaches, one with Hamilton, another with Mulan. So Disney's got significant brand equity. They've also got the platform advantage of being able to use Disney Plus to fuel their other businesses. Talk to us a little bit about the business model of releasing content with incremental fees and or to use it as a driver for other parts of the business.
This is a really interesting question because it hits on a few different elements. I think when you're talking about the role of PVOD or other Disney experiments, the difference between Mulan at $30 and Hamilton at $0, it's important to understand how much all of this is just a test right now. All of the data that we have so far, which is to take a look at the PVOD release of Trolls or of early release of Sonic, the data sets are incredibly low. They're also heavily contaminated by the effects of the pandemic and closure and weather. No one really knows what the right business model is here. We're talking about a time in which not only are tests happening more radically and rapidly than ever before, but where we can't really compare apples to apples. I mean, the normal tests here would be of highly specific films where you do A/B testing on a market. This market's going to get it in one window, another price point, and you try to figure this out. I laugh about the fact that Trolls has effectively become the LBJ of PVOD, which is to say, if anyone wanted to say, let's break the theatrical window, pre-pandemic, I don't think anyone would have said Trolls World Tour is our guy. I don't think that if you said, we want to recalibrate the future of the film industry, you would have said, let's make the bet on Tenet and see whether or not it can revive the industry. Similarly, I don't think that you'd say that Mulan would be your go-to choice to see whether or not you can build a new behavior. That's because it was never really built for North American audiences in the way that other titles were. And similarly, you would say you would go with something like Black Widow, which Disney chose not to do, as opposed to these. And so everyone is trying to figure out their way. I mean, even the AMC distribution deal with Universal for rapid window releases on SVOD, it's 17 days. I think if you look at 17, you can tell how the negotiation went. Clearly, AMC asked for 21 days or 3 weeks, and clearly Universal asked for 14 days or 2 weeks, and they met in the middle. No one really knows. The second part of your question is to understand, again, a great evidence of returns to scale. If we take a step back, we know that the big challenge with direct-to-platform releases, with PVOD, the break-even is really high. You need a lot of user behavior for this to skip the theater and still recoup. In that regard, the fact that Disney Plus has perhaps 40 or 50 million US subscribers is critical to that. If Disney Plus had 20 million, it probably couldn't release Hamilton. Take a look at Paramount. Paramount had to redate A Quiet Place. Paramount doesn't have a highly scaled direct-to-consumer SVOD service. It has Showtime with about 7 million digital customers and CBS at comparable. That means that it basically can't sell its films direct. However, Disney does have the scale. We could argue that HBO does in numbers, but not in digital. Most customers are coming through HBO, through the cable system, and therefore that's an impediment here. And so when we take a look at ancillary monetization or flywheels, the ability to use these products to drive other things, this is another area where scale is a key leverage point. And there are huge differences in terms of how all of these services stack up in that regard.
So do you see further consolidation happening in the industry where the smaller players are just not going to be able to survive? So we'll see more acquisitions and consolidation continue because the scale is such an important driver?
Right. I think ultimately we have to get to these questions of the most efficient allocation of content. And if we take a look at some of the smaller players, there's both an active and a recurring basis question, which is to say Showtime, Epix, and others need to prove on an ongoing basis that they are able to afford the best content possible needed to grow their services, but can be economically afforded when HBO and Amazon and Apple are all bidding on these same titles. The alternate side of that is, well, we can say Paramount owns Mission Impossible. So if they wanted to create a Mission Impossible direct-to-platform video or a Mission Impossible television series, they own that. They can keep that at what will be Paramount Plus or Showtime. However, again, they will still need to prove that those networks can extract more value through vertical integration than just licensing those titles at 3x the price to Netflix or Apple or another bidder. And so ultimately, I wouldn't necessarily say that the question is per se, can they be big enough to survive? The proximate question is, can they monetize effectively enough through specialization, through prices, through a curated brand to offset that scale differential? If Netflix can pay twice as more, but get a 50% higher return because it has 3 times the audience, that's a challenge. And so ultimately, all of these smaller players are going to have to figure out what to do with that. And then on the historical basis, this is a question of whether or not the library is better allocated elsewhere. So if we think about what that means for Starz, Starz will ultimately need to prove that it gets a better return making more shows themselves and not licensing their library than being bought and folded into a much higher scale service. The jury's still out there.
Do you see a role for, I want to be careful in the language I use because I know that some of these services don't consider themselves niche, but I don't have a better word to apply to it. So, for example, Curiosity Stream, Acorn, BritBox, some of the more targeted standalone services, much lower price points. Do you see a continued role for that where consumers are likely to subscribe to a handful of the big ones where they get a big swath of the content that they want to consume, and then the passion point for them is also this, also that?
I think that's all going to be on a case-by-case basis, and it reflects both how distinct the content is as well as the ancillary monetization around that. By what I mean there is, I think you can make a strong argument that something like Fox Nation has a more distinctive, more immediately obvious niche or vertical specific raison d'etre, so to speak, than say an Acorn or BritBox, which is a little bit, more harder to define. But I think we can clearly say that the desire among audiences for content only made for them with their political leanings, with their personalities, makes a little bit more sense than saying, I would like more British dramas with a bespoke login and logo and brand identity versus the British dramas that are on Netflix. So I think we have to distinguish there. Ultimately, there's also going to become a question of ancillary monetization. When I was at the Chernin Group, we managed Crunchyroll. Crunchyroll is a hyper-effective monetizer of a community with other content and products. Examples there being merchandise and expos, community features, podcasts. BritBox has a tougher path, or an Acorn TV has a tougher path to selling t-shirts, selling expos, compared to a Crunchyroll or a Fox Nation, where, again, the ancillary demand and rallying points are a little bit weaker. Ultimately, I believe that these services are going to exist. They have proven that they can exist. The question is just, what's the ceiling and how good of a business are they? And ultimately, as we've seen with HBO Max licensing Studio Ghibli films, the best anime filmmakers in the world to the point of Academy Award wins, with Netflix rebooting some of the most globally successful anime series, licensing some of the others, they're never going to buy everything that a BritBox or Acorn or Crunchyroll or Fox Nation does. However, they are going to go after the most popular top of funnel content. And so we might see that over time they continually chip away at portions of that audience. But ultimately, the question is not unlike what we mentioned on Showtime, which is all of these services, to survive, are going to need to prove not just that the audience likes a distinct brand identity, but that the audience also can be extra monetized through a bespoke service rather than through a much larger service that is selling other things, such as a Netflix.
There are so many questions rolling around in my mind, and we could just go on. And so before I let you go, I do want to touch on technology and platforms and Hollywood versus Silicon Valley, and who's an entertainment company, who's a media company, who's a tech company, and whether or not any of that means anything anymore. So share some thoughts with us in that space.
There has long been this question around exactly that. Is content king? Is distribution king? And obviously the answer is really more of timing. Sometimes one thing is slightly more important than the other, and over time the balance of power, the balance of profits shifts. But as part of that, we've also had this tension between Hollywood and Silicon Valley, tech versus media. I think what's really interesting about this question is that war hasn't happened, and it won't happen. It can't happen. The number one in television, number two in film, Time Warner, was purchased by AT&T, a distributor that wants to and claims to be a tech company. Years ago, Comcast, the nation's largest broadband and television provider, purchased NBC Universal. And of course, NBC Universal is more challenged recently, but its fortunes massively rebounded. The film division was languishing, and in the years since has launched Jurassic World, Fast and Furious, turned into a mega hit, Minions, and so forth. And so if we keep going down the line, you have those two acquisitions. You take a look at Apple, Amazon, Netflix, all obviously tech companies that are the leaders in content today. I'm speaking to you from Canada right now, and the two largest distributors, Rogers and Bell, both wireless and standard telephony and television services, own not only all of the major sports rights in the country, but the most important and popular sports teams as well, such as the Toronto Blue Jays and the Toronto Maple Leafs. This distinction between one versus the other has gone away. There really is no opportunity for content to fight tech. They've become the same thing. And that's an interesting way to cap off this conversation because, as I mentioned at the start of this call, we're inclined towards recency bias to look at what's just happened right now. But the truth of the matter is this convergence has been happening for decades, truly. If Hello Dolly results in Fox being sold from an oil baron to Rupert Murdoch, and as part of that starts acquiring ski resorts and bottling manufacturers, Columbia goes from storied standalone brand to, again, soft drink manufacturer and then a television manufacturer. We're seeing this process over time. The last thing that I'll say on that point is let's take a look at the Walt Disney Company. Walt Disney Pictures, or the studios division, in 2019 generated 3 times the revenue of the number 2 studio. They also did that with 3 times the operating margin of that studio, which means they were 9 times more profitable than the number 2. Extraordinary success. Seems more like a tech distribution than a media one. And yet, the theme parks division generated 100% more revenue, or 2 times the revenue of that division, and 60% more operating income. That is where we're seeing just one part of synergistic platform flywheel type monetization, where the Parks Group, which is as much a tech company as any other, is driving enormous leverage on a content business. And then, of course, we can take a look at Disney today, purchased the independent global leader in video technology distribution, BAMTech. Today, all of its growth is coming from a digital tech direct-to-consumer business. And today, the inarguable core of the Walt Disney Companies is not its studio division, it's not even its IP per se, it's the Disney Plus platform where most of their stories reside, and they're increasingly premiering there too. And so if we say that Disney is the most successful media company we've ever seen, that is a company that I struggle to say is not as close to tech as any other, Netflix or otherwise. And as a result, we look at the world today, and it is one of platforms and flywheels. It is not of standalone media properties. It's not about make a good thing and sell that good thing and rely on a story well told. That's as important as ever, but it's differently important today.
You've shared a lot of valuable perspectives with us today and insights that I'm sure will have folks looking at things a bit differently. And perhaps with all the distinctions blurring and history teaching us so much, we will come to realize that the more things change, the more they stay the same.
For sure. I look forward to having this conversation in another 20 years as we're looking back on exactly the same trend and understanding how we're about to see it again.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Matt. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Hope you found this Thinking Out Loud conversation interesting and perhaps even thought-provoking. There are more on the way. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review.